Welcome to Intention Podcast. I'm Byron DeLear. Well, we are living in extraordinary times. The corona pandemic has fundamentally changed the way we live. This is the third episode of Intention, and I've been documenting different aspects of the crisis, and today we're focusing on the economy. You've lost your job, running out of savings. What are we going to do? Well, I've invited someone who knows a thing or two about hiring and firing, and most importantly, how to get the attention of companies that are actually in hiring mode. Yes, there are companies that are expanding to meet the demands of this new reality. Tate Orick is a global talent acquisition leader with more than 20 years of experience. I know her because we went to military school together when we were in the 4th grade. And that actually factors into our discussion today, that taking a no-nonsense approach, a military mindset, is going to be the best way to rip off the Band-Aid and face the music of what's really going down right now. So if you're going through any of that, listen to Tate Orick, because she's got some good advice. Updating your resume, interview tips are all on the docket for today's episode. Job loss, a hammered economy, and the new abnormal. Well, here we are, Intention Podcast. I'm Byron DeLear, and I have Tate Orick as my guest. So Tate, I've known you for pretty much my whole life, although there was definitely a long period of time, perhaps decades, where we were out of touch. When we were 9 or 10 years old, we both attended Harker Academy in San Jose, California. And that was a military school that I don't know if you realize, but my dad, Walter, had attended when it was called the Palo Alto Military Academy.
Oh, wow.
And then it combined with Harker's Girls School, because at the time, Palo Alto Military Academy was only for boys. But then it combined with Harker's Girls School and became co-ed. The other little factoid, blast from our past, that I wanted to share with you is, I don't know if you remember Captain Torsellini.
Yes.
But he was the head of the cadet program. He was actually my dad's commandant as well.
Really?
And I remember one day during some sort of graduation parade or something like this, we were all in our dress screens and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to salute Captain Torsellini, and my dad was there. And, so it was kind of a good generational moment.
Yeah.
So you and I, we reconnected on Facebook like so many classmates do. But, where are you living now? And tell me a little bit about what you've done since Harker Academy.
Sure. So after Harker, I actually was in the boarding school there. So I lived on campus at Harker for a number of years and then left and went into public school. And I moved to San Diego. And after grade school, high school, went to UC San Diego and wanted to go to medical school. But as life happens, things come up and, you kind of course correct and go in different directions. And it kind of led me into the direction of human resources and talent acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
And in talent acquisition, I started out sourcing. And sourcing means that you're looking at resumes, trying to understand what the qualifications are that a hiring manager is looking for, and then you start seeking out talent. And this was back in the day before we even had, the internet. So it's literally you put an ad in the paper, you have to, get all the resumes in either via mail or fax and start going through them that way. So that's how I learned the talent acquisition craft and been doing it for over 20, 25 years now.
Well, you've worked for some large firms. I noticed in your CV that you've done work for BlackRock and a bunch of different tech firms. The reason why I invited you on the show is because I saw your LinkedIn post. It mentioned that yesterday was a very difficult day.
Mm-hmm.
Myself and other incredible, dedicated, talented, amazing individuals I have ever had the pleasure to work with lost our jobs. You talked about the biggest thing that you were going to miss was that social connection to these amazing people, your colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly in this time right now, we're all missing some of that social connection. I mean, we're trying to stay connected through Zoom and through email and through Facebook Live and these sorts of platforms. But, these are extraordinary times. Our world has completely been upended. I started this podcast a few weeks ago because I wanted to document some of the conversations and observations that are going on during these historic times. And one of the things that I haven't really focused on yet is the economic impact, just the nosedive that our economy has taken. Could you talk a little bit about, working for Sojourn and, what you're doing now to rebrand yourself?
Sure. So Sojourn is a company that started over 12 years ago in Omaha, Nebraska, and now is headquartered in San Francisco. And they are in the travel business. So it's digital advertising for the travel industry. And obviously, the travel industry, like so many other industries, were hit really, really hard by this pandemic. We started to actually see it in about November, December timeframe. And that's right about when we were going to launch our Japan offices in the APAC region. And to watch it, it was almost like free falling because you saw it happen so quickly. And it was already a question of, okay, we know that we're going to have to go through the layoff process because we're losing $1 million a day.
Wow.
Yeah. And how are we going to do this? But also, how can we be really thoughtful about it? And the first group of people really to go, it's not usually the last one hired is the first one fired. It's usually the talent acquisition team because the first thing you do is you go through a hiring pause. And the majority of companies in the US right now are under a hiring pause. I use the word pause instead of freeze because freeze just has such a negative connotation because when the market picks back up, we will start hiring again and we will come off the pause and get going again. But right now, it's just so tragic. I think what was so hard about leaving Sojourn is, my team and I were able to hire over 200 people in 2019. And in the first 2 months of 2020, hire over 50 new people. And I think that speaks volumes to the dedication that my team had. It was a truly unique culture. And to see these people who are now, millennials, and this was their first job out of college, and to see them now having to try and navigate this new normal of filing for unemployment and trying to seek new employment. And in some regions, it's easier to do in others, but we had over 230 people who are in the middle of the country in Nebraska. And it's not that huge of a job market in terms of tech, what these individuals were looking for. So that's where the concern for me was. I'm more concerned, I think, for my coworkers than I am myself. I think, because I've been doing this for so long that I just have a really strong network. I'm not too concerned about how I will come out of this, but more concerned for my coworkers and how I can help them come out of this and how to help them network. I think one of the things that was so hard for me and so tragic to watch was, on a daily basis, small business losing business. There's this small little deli that I would go to every single morning in San Francisco for my coffee. And he is an Armenian immigrant who started his deli business in 1972. And I'd go and I'd get coffee every morning and chit chat with him. And we'd talk about our families, et cetera. And I came to know this man. And to watch him have to lay off the people who he's had working for him for decades, it's heartbreaking. These are hardworking people who aren't in the tech industry. These are people who live paycheck to paycheck. And it's just heartbreaking to watch that. It's very different, this pandemic, to see how it's affecting the economy as opposed to when we went through the housing market crash or even after 9/11. I've really been describing this as, and I hate to equate it to it, but this is almost like getting the cancer diagnosis where you get the diagnosis and then you start thinking, okay, now what's next? Oncology. Then you go see oncology and then they tell you, okay, well, you have X amount of months.
Right.
Yeah. And with 9/11, it was almost like a car crash. Like it was immediate and we felt the grief immediately and we saw the devastation and we also saw the devastation to our economy. This is completely different.
It really strikes at the heart of so many cultural mores and habits and behaviors that we just assumed were going to continue in perpetuity.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to be handshaking anymore.
No.
I used to work in the entertainment industry, and a lot of my musician friends, they're completely freaked out. They're trying to press in and do a bunch of Facebook Live concerts every day and this kind of thing. But the idea of mass gatherings at sporting events, which,
Mm-hmm.
Sporting events is a form of entertainment,
Yeah.
Concerts. Until there's a vaccine, which is probably more than a year out, Unless there's some sort of therapeutic breakthrough, like the hydroxychloroquine issue, if that proves out to have value, unless there's some significant therapeutic resources that can be deployed, I don't really see large portions of our economy returning to a sense of normalcy. I mean, in particular, when you consider large gatherings, corporate travel, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this is a real reset.
Oh, yeah. Right before, the nation went into lockdown, you saw companies like Facebook, Salesforce, Microsoft canceling their annual conferences. While I was at Sojourn, we had an annual conference where we brought in all 600 of our employees from around the world to Omaha, Nebraska every year in May, and we had to cancel that. And I think it's really changed how the nation is doing things in social gatherings. I mean, Major League Baseball, my sister and I were supposed to attend opening day for the Dodgers, and that's canceled. And you look at how this is just affecting everything that we considered a part of our everyday normal.
The baseball hit is a major issue in St. Louis, with the St. Louis Cardinals being the flagship sporting entity in the city. It's you think about all the people that work the
Oh, yeah.
concessions, that offer food, that do parking. I mean,
Mhm.
all that stuff is off the table now. And the scale of the economic damage is just breathtaking. I saw in one poll that more than half of all Americans under the age of 45 said that they have lost their jobs or suffered a loss of hours.
Mhm.
And, I think roughly about 10% of the American workforce has now filed for unemployment benefits in the past 3 weeks. This is 17 million people.
Yeah.
To compare that to the Great Recession in '07, '08, '09, over a period of about 18 months, I believe that the Great Recession is cited as impacting or wiping out 15 million jobs. So we are way past where the Great Recession was. And in fact, most likely, a lot of these impacts haven't hit the numbers counters yet.
No, they haven't. And I think that, just the stats that keep coming out, they're staggering, and people will continue to lose their jobs. As you look at the curve starting to flatten in California and in New York, now it's in the news. They're saying it's going to hit, Heartland this week. It's going to hit
Right.
Michigan really, really hard, and places that really haven't been impacted. And I thought that it was really interesting when we in San Francisco and New York, who take mass transit to get everywhere, we were very concerned about, riding on the subway and riding on the buses to get to work. And in Omaha, Nebraska, they really didn't understand why we were so concerned about it, because they don't have those issues. Yet it was our offices in Nebraska where we had our first cases of COVID, and not in our San Francisco or even our Singapore offices. And once it hit, that's when we had to close our offices. And
Right.
it's so heartbreaking to see all this happen.
Just to pile on here, although there is some light at the end of the tunnel, which I will get into in a moment, but the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, which is part of the Federal Reserve System, they estimate that the coronavirus outbreak could cost 47 million jobs this quarter.
That's crazy.
Moody's analysts are forecasting that 45 million jobs could be at risk, including 75% of the workers in the hospitality and construction industries.
Mm-hmm.
That impacts the industry that I work in. The company I work for is called Y-Green, and we offer financing for energy technology and energy upgrades on residential property and commercial property. And although those industries have been cited as essential businesses, meaning the upkeep of private sector and public infrastructure, we've definitely seen a drop in our business because people are constricting their spending habits. Everybody's pulling back because the whole population is in a state of trauma. I did see an article that did mention some of the companies that happen to be hiring right now,
Mm-hmm.
and they're reacting to this market adjustment and shift. There was widely reported that Amazon is looking to hire 100,000 new workers.
Yep.
In some ways, you could say that this is really now how Amazon's going to basically take over the planet. I mean, in terms of the transition towards online sales. But there's a company called Instacart that
Mm-hmm.
says it's looking to hire 300,000 contract workers. CVS Health is hiring 50,000 employees. Walmart is hiring 50,000 workers. Dollar General, the dollar store, says it's looking to add about 50,000 employees by the end of April. Pizza Hut is
Mm-hmm.
hiring 30,000 permanent employees because, pizza and delivery, that's a growth business right now.
Yeah.
Ace Hardware is hiring 30,000 people. Lowe's is hiring 30,000 people. Dollar Tree is hiring 25,000 people. Walgreens is hiring 25,000 people. I mean, these are big numbers.
Oh,
So
yeah.
you're actually seeing the market in a decentralized, innovative, entrepreneurial, really existential way. The market is absorbing these changes and shifts are happening right now.
Yeah, and I think that, you look at those companies that are hiring, it's different from what we're used to seeing, but then you look at companies who are kind of shifting what their bread and butter was. And you have companies like Tesla who are now making ventilators because people aren't buying cars at the moment. You have companies like Google and Apple, who are competitors, yet now they're working together on an app to help figure out the proximity if you've been in contact with somebody who could possibly have COVID. So I think that it's really interesting how, the marketplace is shifting and what you see in terms of jobs that are available. I think, for someone like me who's in the talent acquisition market, I think I'm fortunate because I've recruited from everything under the sun, from federal law enforcement to people who are actually on the floor at Chrysler Corporation making the cars. And I have such a diverse background that I can go into almost any field, where you have a lot of people in talent who really try and just hone in on one industry, and maybe they focus on fintech or maybe they focus on just technology. And I think it's really going to change how people are going to look for jobs now. I think you're going to see people really just applying for a lot of things that are maybe out of their skill set and maybe reinvent themselves because, one, they need the compensation, but two, technology and jobs as we know it is over for the moment until we can open up the country again and, commerce gets going. It's extremely different from anything that we've ever seen. And I think that, we will get back to business, but when? And the when is, a question that a lot of people are asking, because how are they going to get by? You have so many people right now relying on food banks just to, help their families get by on a daily basis. You're going to see probably a lot more homelessness in a lot of these states and cities because people have lost their jobs. And let's face it, unemployment is not going to get them through. It might help put food on the table, but it's certainly not going to help pay your mortgage or your car payment or things like that.
Yeah, I mean, the instances of mental health
Oh,
are going to
wow.
spike.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Our most vulnerable are being more severely impacted. You've seen a lot of reports about the percentages of lives lost in and among African American communities.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that just really reveals some of the weaknesses of our healthcare system, how we really don't have a structured healthcare system that is community oriented, that our healthcare system perhaps, I'm a Democrat. I've been advancing the need for universal health care for many, many years. I think that this crisis is exposing a lot of those vulnerabilities. We have the opportunity to look at those vulnerabilities and weaknesses and try to get things back on track and more
Mm-hmm.
equitable. The aid bill that was passed at the end of March allocated approximately, $350 billion to support small businesses in
Mm-hmm.
the Paycheck Protection Program. Tate, have you had any experience with any of your colleagues in terms of applying to the banks to get
Yes.
this Paycheck
Yes.
Protection Program coverage, which basically would allow small businesses, if they qualify and there's certain attributes that they have to abide by, and then you have to spend the money either on utilities or on actual payroll. But tell me a little bit about the experience of that, what you're hearing out there in terms of protecting some of these jobs, because one of the attributes of the legislation set forth an ability for a company not to have to make payments on the loan if they actually retain their workers and use the money in the next 8 weeks or within 8 weeks after the loan is granted for certain categories that would allow them then to essentially the loan becomes a grant.
It does, but I think what I'm seeing with some of the companies and what I'm hearing from my colleagues out there is the hoops that you have to jump through to get these loans is unbelievable. It's not as I think it's pretty sugar coated out there in the media in terms of it sounds great, but in order to really qualify for these and get them implemented is another thing. I have a friend who is, she's trying to get all the paperwork done, and every time they get the paperwork done and they turn it in, it's well, we need this now. Well, we need this now, and then also, you have to have your company at a certain size. So part of knowing that these programs were going to be coming out was also part of the thought process in how many people you have to lay off in order to qualify for some of these. So I think that it's kind of a double-edged sword here. It's 8 weeks, and really in 8 weeks, are you really going to be saving that much money when you get the support from these programs? And is it really worth it? And she asked me for my advice, and I said, it'll get you through the short term. I said, but then, you're going to have to scale back up once the economy picks back up, and it's going to be more expensive to scale back up, and also qualifying for it. There's so many stipulations in terms of the different businesses that actually qualify for this. So it's not necessarily a good thing for small business. I have another friend whose company was trying to convince her to exercise her right for the Family Medical Leave Act. Her spouse was diagnosed with cancer, and so they were trying to say, well, why don't you go out on Family Medical Leave Act? And that would also protect her and the company under one of the grants that allows for the payroll protection. So I just really think that it's interesting how they will actually roll those out and actually how many companies will be able to benefit from those, small business.
So do you see the intent of the legislators, the federal legislators that passed the $2 trillion stimulus package as perhaps, being, of course, well-intentioned, and they moved relatively quickly, but being that they've made the banks the gatekeepers.
Mm-hmm.
So, the federal government aren't the gatekeepers, but the banks are. And, I read somewhere that the banks are starting to impose new conditions on this loan program, such as refusing to deal with new customers.
Mm-hmm.
That leaves many businesses frustrated, as you mentioned, and as gatekeepers, they're providing resistance. Do you think there needs to be a broader call to get the banks to play ball?
I do, because I think, like you said, it's very well intentioned, but in actuality, to get those loans, the banks aren't wanting to play ball right now. It's almost the whiplash factor from when we had the housing crash, and the banks really learned a hard lesson from that. And I think that now they're being told by the government, well, we need to do this to save, the country. And I really think that a lot of these banks are pretty gun shy, and they're not willing to play ball. You've got startup companies who are backed by venture capital, and they're getting only so much money put into the companies right now. Also, because when they don't qualify for some of these loans, and then some of the venture capitalists are saying, okay, we'll apply for the loans. And these companies don't qualify for it because the banks want you to jump through so many hoops.
And also, just to interject, I believe that if a company is backed by venture capital, isn't that one of the disqualifiers?
Yes and no. It really depends on when you received your last round of funding, and if the company has been able to funnel any money under a certain dollar amount into the company. It's again, there's so many restrictions on this that I really don't see that there's going to be a lot of benefit to a lot of these companies.
What do you think the business community and, in particular, small business owners, I'm thinking about a lot of the people that are in a state of fear about their economic future. As you mentioned earlier,
Mm-hmm.
a large percentage of the populace lives paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
And, you look at the lines that have been created for food banks. I think that there were some aerial pictures in
Mm-hmm.
San Antonio, Texas, of the cars lined up. And essentially it looked like an aerial picture of a Walmart parking lot where every single space was filled with a car. I mean,
Exactly.
or it was a picture of a car dealership, you know.
Yeah.
And these are like the breadlines in the Great Depression,
I
right?
was just going to say that it's very reflective of that. I don't think that the government is doing enough to support the everyday Joe. It's going to get even more difficult. The president keeps talking about how great the nation was and how great, he's doing. And this is, the greatest of times. Yet that's maybe only 1%. And you have the people who are still living paycheck to paycheck. And this is really hitting them the hardest. The aerial coverage of those lines just for people to get food for their families, it's heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking. It's tragic.
It is beyond tragic. And I just don't think that there's enough understanding and empathy, true empathy for what the everyday person is going through.
You've identified some qualities that, in particular, I mean, in the past, I've been charitable to the president. In the first episode of this podcast, I had thought that he had turned a corner and was starting to face the music in regard to the science, in contrast to what he had done for several months and basically putting his head in the sand and trying to deny the reality of the threat of this pandemic. He had turned a corner. He was starting to face the science. But when you talk about empathy, I can't think of a political leader or corporate leader that has such an explicit lack of
Of
empathic
empathy.
qualities than
Yeah.
President Trump. And
Yeah.
to contrast that, and to be sure, Tate, I'm a Democrat, so
Ditto.
take this with a grain of salt. Biden, on the other hand, he is the political empath.
hmm Well, I think that this, I'm a Democrat as well, but I think that this goes beyond Democrat, Republican. I think that this becomes an issue of humankind. And that's the thing that this president doesn't understand. He's made this country more divisive than ever, and it continues to be so. And I think during this time of crisis, it truly needs to be about how can you support your fellow American, not your fellow Democrat, not your fellow Republican. And he doesn't understand that. He doesn't understand that it's not an us against them. This is an us issue. And you have to look at how would our founding fathers have supported, the country through this crisis. This is somebody who is so unempathetic and doesn't understand the plight of the everyday Joe because he's never had to be in their shoes. And I think that you have to have somebody who truly understands what the everyday American goes through in order to support and lead that. And you have to lead the country through something like that. And I don't think that he's capable of doing that. Right now is the time where you have to truly be a leader because the people of America are looking to you to lead us through this crisis.
Indeed.
Not lead us through, fear factor. You need to calm this and you need to give us facts. And it can't be, I've done the greatest job. It's not about you. And I think that that's one of the things that he continues to not understand. It's not about him as a person. It's about us as a nation.
Well, there was a pivotal article written by George Conway. I think it was something like 8,000 words in the New Yorker. And George Conway is the attorney husband of Kellyanne Conway, who happens to be, she was the campaign manager for Trump at the end of his political campaign in 2016 and continues on as a White House advisor. But George Conway really shined a light on the lack of capacity for Trump just to have a reasonable appraisal of his environment because of this hyper sense of self-interest, toxic, narcissistic personality disorder, where the world that he looks at, mental conditions, and I'm not a doctor, but mental conditions, they have a capacity for the subject to morph time and space into their own paradigm in their head.
Yeah.
And as Trump is metabolizing this crisis, I really feel like he does not have the capacity to rise to the occasion. And, I heard some of the professional doctors from Johns Hopkins today on the Sunday morning programs. Today's Easter Sunday. And they danced around the topic without really going there. But, this is a podcast, and, we try to be truth tellers in these deep dive, long form conversations. The fact is that lives have been lost because of the dithering and backpedaling that this president had engaged in not preparing this country properly for what the scientists were warning and telling him, his national security advisors were warning and telling him. One of his most trusted White House aides, Peter Navarro, wrote a memo at the end of January that said explicitly that this could result in 500,000 American casualties. And yet he just kept on saying, oh, there's 15 cases, and that's going to go down to 10, and that's going to go down to 5. And then, it's going to miraculously disappear. And, the other perspective I think that's important here is that when you are the commander in chief of the United States of America, in contrast to, say, a state legislator like in Sacramento in California, or in Jefferson City in Missouri, if you're a state legislator, you may not really have the power of life and death in such an explicit fashion as when you are the commander of the largest military ever assembled in the history of humanity. I mean, this is definitely a transition. I mean, when Barack Obama, as a state senator in Illinois, all of a sudden became a U.S. senator, the stakes became much more real in terms of deploying our military in defensive actions around the world. I mean, this is what senators vote on.
Right.
So when you become a member of the federal government, you do have the power of life and death in your hands, and that cannot be more pronounced than when you are the actual head of the executive branch as the president. So having said that, I still think that when you consider the fact that over 20,000 Americans have now lost their lives, over 500,000 Americans have had the coronavirus, those numbers could be significantly lower if we had a president that was attached to reality.
Oh, 100% agree. I mean, I think that if you look at, what China did when this virus first came out, they started assembling these makeshift hospitals. I mean, how quickly they were able to put those up to deal with the virus, that is something that a leader needs to take charge of and do. Yet this president did not believe that it would come to America like that. Like you said earlier, he wanted to stick his head in the sand. He believed that by closing our borders or, limiting the amount of people that would come into the country, that this would slow it down. And that's just not the case. And I think that we've discussed about being a leader, and this person is not a leader. I think that a leader is somebody who leads by example. A leader is somebody who thinks more about other people than themselves.
Yeah.
And not the case here. Our nation was so unprepared for what we have seen and what we are truly dealing with. I mean, we've never seen anything like this in our lifetime, Byron, and I don't know that we will again. And what's so interesting about this is it's not like 9/11 where it hit the United States. It's not like the housing crash, which again hit the United States. This is a world issue. Before this week, Italy had the highest number of deaths from this virus. Now this week, it's the United States. This isn't something that's just affecting us. It's affecting the world. And I think that the U.S. continues to be a joke on the world stage in terms of the lack of leadership that we do see from the commander in chief. Prior to this, sure, we had a great economy, but that's also because we had people who believed in commerce and business, and not just about making America great again, but, we had people who really wanted to see everybody succeed and get ahead. And it was great. And we kept hearing, that the market's going to crash or that the market's going to take a downturn. But I don't think anybody thought that it would look like this.
Oh, of course not.
Yeah. And I don't think anybody thought that it would play out on a world stage like this. Again, we've never seen anything like this. I know that, I've posted some LinkedIn posts about, okay, you've lost your job, now what? And just trying to help people navigate through what to expect next. And I know that we're going to bounce back as a nation. And I think that the bounce back in terms of getting jobs and going back back out into the marketplace is going to happen, and we'll scale back up, and there'll be a lot of great talent out in the marketplace. But people, like I said earlier, they're going to have to reinvent themselves.
So, speaking to that, your background and skill set in HR and in talent acquisition, your experience with just a plethora of different corporate environments, perhaps a new role, and this is just something I'm flashing on, perhaps a new role, Tate, that you could adopt is more from a consultant standpoint, where you're advising companies on the implications to their workforce and perhaps interfacing with some of these workers to help allow them to rebrand themselves. So, as you're rebranding yourself, perhaps the core of your consulting business could be rebranding the American workforce.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think that one thing that I continually am flattered that people reach out to me for my opinion, and these are former coworkers. These are people that I haven't even worked with. These are people from companies that I've gone in to do, they've asked me to come in and be a guest speaker, and then I leave. And, I have people reach out to me afterwards asking me if I would be interested in mentoring them, because I have a lot of experience and I have a lot to say. I think also the way that I go about business is it's very military. It's very straightforward, no nonsense. I'm very process oriented and not always one size fits all, but I'm really strategic in the sense that when I do come into an organization, I look at, what's going to work and what's not going to work. And I can assess that pretty quickly. So to have the opportunity to come in and consult for some companies would be, amazing, just because I do think I have a lot of experience on how to navigate through these really difficult times, and also how to scale back up. A lot of my experience is in scaling. I mean, I was able to scale, hire 50 people in 2 months at the beginning of this year, and 20 of those were in Europe alone, 5 in Dubai, which is a difficult marketplace. So I definitely know how to do that. So you have to be really open to branding yourself, and you also have to be your own advocate. And not a lot of people have the same level of confidence in their abilities that I do, but I think that it's like I tell people when they're going to an interview situation, you are a subject matter expert in what you know. That's what you need to tell your interviewers. They're going to ask you questions based on your background. You shouldn't be nervous, because that's what you do and that's what you know. So they're just asking you the questions on your background.
You mentioned the military strategic approach, and that definitely resonates with the work that I do, not only being a student of history and studying military history and in particular the Revolutionary era for America. I think that when you have that no-nonsense approach towards realizing outcomes and the ethos that dictates that to be a responsible leader, you're not going to delegate jobs to people that are incapable of executing on those jobs. So you really have to press in and know what the broader skill set is of your entire team. I mean, this is what a quarterback, this is what a coach does on a football team. There's, of course, lots of analogies here.
Sure.
That definitely holds true, in particular for some of the work that I do politically. I often have to face political opponents that are attempting to shut down clean energy, for example, in favor of fossil fuels, for example. And, you have to really take a three-dimensional decentralized approach towards waging that type of a campaign so that your arguments are built on foundation that is unassailable. And that really ticks and ties, to use an accounting term, that ticks and ties with military strategy. Hopefully in the future we won't have any more wars. but maybe turn the channel on emphasizing military strategy too much. Hopefully we won't have any more wars. But there are going to be competitive endeavors that we engage in as a species for the long-term future that may not result in death, but rather result in actually uplifting the overall quality for human life. Do the most good for the most people in the future. I mean, this is what I really believe is the basis of a progressive ideology. I think about the changes that are coming around the corner that we're in the middle of, that we're riding on this roller coaster right now,
Yeah.
culturally, economically. After the Great Flu pandemic of 1918, there were certain cultural changes that happened.
Right.
For example, I read that the common drinking cup was outlawed during the crisis, and obviously the notion of a common drinking cup is no longer really prevalent. I think that public spitting, I think that I mean, as uncouth as that is a habit that withered on the vine after, the 600,000 Americans died in the Spanish flu or the Great Flu pandemic.
And in some countries, that is actually outlawed, like in Singapore. If you spit on the sidewalk, you will get arrested and caned. I think the way that our nation's going to come out of this is going to be really, really interesting. And you brought up a really good point a minute ago about leaders and coming out of this. I think that what's really going to make a difference is how CEOs go about leading their companies out of this and into, the new future. A lot of companies did not like the work from home model. Previously, they really wanted the workforce to be in the office.
Right.
And this has really forced our country and companies to have a work from home model. And I think that now a lot of companies and CEOs are really getting used to this.
The Zoomification of the American economy.
Exactly. And I think that, a good leader, like I said earlier, leads by example. And that holds true for CEOs. There's some CEOs who take all the glory for themselves and, it's all about them and about their paycheck. And there's a lot, and I could name them by name on Wall Street who are like this. But then there's some people who truly, truly are in it and they're at the companies and they lead for the people. And you see that in their actions on a daily basis. And they have that genuine authenticity that I think is lacking in a lot of leaders these days. And I think that it's really going to be paramount to see how these leaders lead us into the recovery after this, because it will be the workers looking to the CEOs to say, okay, how are we going to turn around the companies now? But then you're going to have very smart and strategic people in talent to say, okay, this is now how we have to scale back up. And you also have to make sure that you are being responsible when you scale back up, that you don't scale too fast, because you want to make sure that your workforce has an opportunity to learn and absorb, unless you're hiring back the people that you had to let go. It really has to be done with finesse, and you really have to have people in place who really know how to do that in order to make the company successful and get back on track after we come out of this. It's going to be really, really interesting to see how we come out of this, Byron.
So Tate, give some advice to those listening to this podcast. Say you're a lower or middle income wage earner, or even someone that is in the corporate space that perhaps has been laid off. What resources would you suggest to guide them as they, maybe take a breath during the trauma to wrap their minds around rebranding themselves? And, what online resources are out there? Do you have any words of advice for people to put their nose to the ground to really find out what trends are happening in the economy, to see how the economy is morphing right under our feet, and to help them get to a place of safety again?
Sure. I mean, I have always been and will continue to be a huge fan of the LinkedIn platform. I think that it's imperative and it's an essential tool to have for the person who's looking to network and also to find, new jobs. I think it's really important that you make sure that if you do have a LinkedIn profile, that it is current and up to date, and that your resume is also current and up to date. The other thing to remember that LinkedIn is a professional network. It's not your Facebook, so you don't want pictures of your family on there. You want a professional picture of yourself, and you want to make sure that you have your most pertinent information in there. There's also a ton of tools on LinkedIn where, they have a program called Rock Your Profile. And that really is, it's a webinar for you to make sure that you're really putting your profile out there in the best light possible, making sure that you're capturing all of your true information. Also, LinkedIn is a really great tool for looking for new jobs. You can put in what you're looking for and what city, what state you're looking for, and it'll pop up. Indeed's another really good platform.
What was that again?
Indeed.
Indeed.
Yes, Indeed. It's more, I would say, lower level, if you will, kind of like in the middle of in the middle, if you will. I'd say LinkedIn's more corporate America. Indeed is kind of like a mixed bag. But what I found really interesting is Indeed is really, really big over in Asia. 87.1 million views in Japan alone in the month of December for the Indeed job board. So each country has a very different way that they go about it, but LinkedIn for the United States is huge. The other thing I would say is you have to be your own brand ambassador. So that means that you have to brand yourself. You have to be your own cheerleader. You have to make sure that you're on LinkedIn and you're connecting with people in your network. That's what it's there for. It's not just to, have as many people connected here and there and everywhere. That's what it's for. I always say to my hiring managers, it's probably somebody in your LinkedIn network that's going to help us find our next hire. Because it's those 7 degrees of separation, if you will. So it's reaching out to those people who might be able to help you. And they might not have an opening at their company, but somebody in their network, they might know somebody who's looking for somebody with that skill set. So I would say that you definitely want to make sure that your LinkedIn is up to date and current, and your resume as well. When you do get that initial interview, the thing that I would say is really important right now is to not take the PTSD that a lot of people have from this pandemic into the interview situation. And what I mean by that is don't take the negative feelings that you have from this and the negative and say, well, I lost my job and the company laid me off and badmouth the company. The company had to do these layoffs. Nobody wanted to. It was a matter of the company surviving. So don't take the negative of what happened to you in your previous place of employment into the interview situation. You really want to stay as positive as you can and put yourself in the best light possible. I always say confidence without arrogance, and that means that you should be as confident as you can be in your own abilities without having the arrogance. I think that there's a time and place for arrogance, and in the interview, it is not the time. I think that that's really your time to shine, and you definitely want to toot your own horn, but there's definitely a way to do it. You want to make sure that you're listening to the questions of the interviewer. You don't interrupt them and you don't talk over them. You want to make sure that after every question that is asked, you really pause for a moment and think about it before you give your answer, and give thoughtful answers and honest answers. Make sure you do your research the company that you're talking to before you get on the phone with them and do your interview. I can't tell you that for a person in the talent field, I find it really disrespectful when a person gets on the phone and I ask them about the company and they're like, I really don't know anything about you. And that tells me that they only applied to the company because we're in a certain industry and that they really have no intentions of working for us. They just kind of want a job.
I've heard that when resumes are sent in, that there's some automated processes that earmark and flag resumes so that real human eyes only look at a subset of those that are sent in. How can you advise people to actually get a hearing and not be set aside by the robot?
Sure. So it's keywords. So if I'm looking for a role as a global talent acquisition leader, I'm going to make sure that in my resume, I have global talent acquisition leader, if that's what that particular job description is asking for. Every job that you apply for, you kind of want to tailor your resume a little bit to that particular opening. I know it sounds time consuming, but right now we kind of have time on our hands to be able to do that. So you want to tailor your resume to it. So you want to look at a job description, and if it says global, and if it says EMEA and APAC, which is for Europe and Asia Pacific, you want to make sure that you have those keywords in your resume. If part of the job description is scaling teams and metrics, you want to make sure that you have those keywords in your resume, because what happens when you go to apply to these is is the keywords are going to be picked up by the computer programs, and those people who have those keywords in their resumes are the ones that are going to go to the front of the line first, because the computer systems are going to pick those out. It sounds like that might not be the fairest approach, but unfortunately, a lot of these applicant tracking systems today, known as ATS, they have a lot of those built-in features. So when you put in your new job description, it asks you what are the key attributes of a person that you're looking for, and you put in those keywords, and then the computer is going to find the keywords of those resumes that come in, and it's going to populate, maybe the top 50 candidates for the recruiters when they go to look at those resumes first.
These are just great pointers and guidance for folks, and I really appreciate you bringing your expertise and sharing it with everybody, Tate.
Oh, of course, my pleasure.
You mentioned that we all have a lot of time on our hands, and a fair amount of the postings that I've seen have focused less on perhaps the empirical, concrete attributes of the crisis and the very significant losses that we're seeing, but more on ephemeral, philosophical approaches. A friend of mine who I used to work with at Y Green, Carla Hebert, posted on LinkedIn, and she said, "Look out, the pandemic has given us a gift.
Yeah.
Think deeply about what kind of new normal you want to bring back, what kind of BS you want to eradicate from your lives. Take a breath and consider bringing back only what truly could make our collective existence happier, better, more worthwhile and sustainable. Bring back only what makes you, us, proud."
Yeah, I think that that's true. I mean, I think that it's given us an opportunity to kind of go back to, for lack of a better word, old-fashioned values. Both my kids are home right now during this pandemic. One's back from college because schools are closed, and the other one is home because she lost her job. So she's, got to hang out with mom and dad for a minute. But the family is sitting together, and we're doing things like playing card games and board games and, doing puzzles together. And to get out and get some fresh air, we're actually taking family walks together. And it's things that you maybe take for granted in the past because we get so busy with our everyday lives. And it kind of has given us a gift in that, we're back to those family values. We've been in lockdown for over a month now, and nobody's killed each other yet.
I've always heard about this contrast in years past, high tech versus high touch. And, and the idea would be that if you're working on outreach policies and engagement, that actually being present and available and engaged, that really trumps email spams, for example.
Yeah.
But, now we won't be shaking hands ever again.
No.
So, you think about how that high touch now is going to, I think it's really going to make people lean forward to try to communicate with more empathy and connection, because we're not hugging and handshaking each other and backslapping anymore. But, so you talk about these traditional values that are resurging, but it's going to be a different kind of traditional value. It's going to be one born of forthright communication and engagement and communicating a sense of understanding without touching people.
Yeah.
And I know that I'm focusing in on a very perhaps narrow aspect of the shift, but I think that the age of communicators has come.
I don't think that it's narrow at all. I think it's realistic. If I think about when you go into, and I'll use an interview, for example, the first thing you do in an interview situation is you shake the hand of the person that you're getting interviewed by. And I would always say you can tell a lot by a person how they shake your hand, whether it's a firm handshake or whether it's a limp handshake. You can tell a lot about a person that way. We're going to be getting away from this completely, where, maybe the new normal will be the elbow touch.
I call it the chicken wing.
Exactly, the chicken wing, or like, in the Japanese culture where you bow. I mean, I think that it's going to bring about a new way that we do communicate. it's going to be really, really interesting to see how we come through this, because you and I grew up, going to military school, that it's all about respect. And that's also the art of the handshake. It's about respect. You seal a deal. It's a handshake. You give your word to somebody. It's a handshake. I think that the way that we approach things now is going to be very, very different in how we convey that. I was watching a thing on, CBS's Sunday Morning, and it was all about, now the sincerity of your actions will be your facial expressions and your body language, and also what your eyes are telling
Right,
somebody.
right.
Correct. And I would always tell my one recruiter, she would wear her expressions on her face, and she didn't have a good poker face. And I would tell her, you really need to work on that.
My political consultant, Jim Ross, for several different political campaigns, he would always say that that person's facial, when they wear their emotions and feelings on their face, and do not have an ability to diplomatically be judicious about what you're communicating and not communicating in the moment. This is something I touched on in episode 2 of the podcast with my friend and colleague Tom Applebaum. And that is that there seems to be a general consensus about politicians that they're like car salesmen, and that they never say what they mean, and that they're inauthentic. And then you have people like Bernie Sanders or even Donald Trump come on the scene who ooze of authenticity because their message discipline is either through the roof, like with Bernie Sanders has been saying the same thing for 20, 30 years. Same thing with Donald Trump. He's been saying the same thing for 20, 30 years. But I think that that's off the mark. Because when you are in a position of power and you have the capacity to govern, you need to parse your words, because your words have impact.
Oh, absolutely.
Your words actually influence people's lives. And so if you detect a degree of equivocation coming from, a local elected official, that's them trying to be responsible. Now, there may be a portion of their motivation that is completely self-serving about, kind of like a CYA, cover your ass sort of a factor in terms of them not being upfront. But there is a whole section of communication that is not based on just CYA, but rather you're trying to be responsible in how you communicate. And if you're fielding difficult questions, and this is the same in an interview. I think that for talent acquisition people like yourself, if somebody is a little hesitant in the way they answer, that's not automatically bad.
It's not that it's bad, but I think that, I hear myself described like this all the time. I'm very military. I'm very strategic. I'm very straightforward and to the point. I think that it's served me well in some instances, because I've never been intimidated to deal with CEOs and, leadership teams. But then in some cases, it hasn't served me well, meaning some people are really, really intimidated by my style. And I think that
because you come off like a hammer.
Yeah. And so I've had to learn how to take the hammer and turn that into a scalpel. How can I be more, for lack of a better word, you take the hammer and turn it into a scalpel. And so it's reading the room, and it's also adjusting your style to your audience.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I've really had to learn how to do that. I'm who I am. I've gotten to where I am today by being my authentic self. And sometimes I say, I really don't want to have to water myself down for somebody. A lot of people appreciate my straightforward and strategic approach, and a lot of people don't. And I think it's trying to find that balance of really what works. And in talent acquisition, it's a lot of people want straightforward facts and information, but you're also dealing with people, and every person is different. So really adjusting that. It's also adjusting how I work with all of my different recruiters on a global basis. Everybody has a different personality and how you manage people. So what works for one of my recruiters might not work for another, the style that I have with them. But the message is always the same.
So we're talking here on Sunday afternoon, Easter Sunday, Passover, Pesach just happened last week. And, those two religious holidays or events are concerned with healing and protection and safety. I think that there is some hopeful signs in terms of the COVID-19 infection rates. The acceleration of those increased rates are starting to reduce. And, Winston Churchill in 1942 during World War II said, now is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but, it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
What are you doing, Tate, in terms of your personal life and your family through this stay-at-home period that we're in? Talk about how you're advising your loved ones and your family.
Sure. Well, I think I'm fortunate enough that I have horses, so equine therapy is very real. So I'm actually taking advantage of the downtime to spend a lot of time out in the barn with my horses. And I have my kids out there as well. They're not usually ones to come out to the barn, and they don't, have that same love for equine as I do. But I feel for their mental health right now, I think it's a good distraction. I'm also reaching out to people in my network, and I'm calling them, I'm texting them, I'm sending them funny memes, just because everybody doesn't have as strong as a mentality as I do. I think that, the mental health crisis that we had prior to this is going to be even worse because you're isolating people,
Right.
and people need that human interaction with each other. And now they're being forced to isolate, and a lot of people don't handle it as well. So I'm just really trying to make sure that I'm reaching out to people that I care about, people that I haven't talked to maybe in a hot minute. And then just, saying, hey, I'm here for you. Even if you just need to call and scream, at the top of your lungs, I'm here for you to do that too. I've been doing that with a lot of my colleagues. A lot of people that I've met through, my different job opportunities through the years, making sure that I'm staying in touch with people on Facebook. I'm posting pictures on my Instagram of my horses because it's an escape for people. It makes them feel better. It makes them smile.
Yeah, I post pictures of my little baby boy Walker, who's 10 and a half months old.
Yeah.
And a lot of people express appreciation. He's quite a personality. And I'm proud.
Yeah, of course you are. And you should be. But I think that, I've always tried to be just a really positive person because I don't want to feed into the negative. I think that the negative is just going to eat you up. And I just try and operate on that level. So I try and spread as much joy and sunshine to those around me. And some people are just like, enough already. And I'm like, no, it's not enough. I think that you have to continually try and encourage people and stay as positive as you can. It's like you and I reaching out to each other. It's that human action that you have with people who mean something to you and that you care about, regardless how long it's been since you've spoken to one another. You had that connection one time. And I think that those,
when we were 9.
yeah. And I think that those lasting friendships that, you and I have, that we have with Paul Eliason, even with Coach Walsh, our sixth grade teacher, that we
he was the best.
Yeah, but that we still have with him today. I think that those relationships that, formed an opinion on you and helped formulate and kind of, make you the person to who you are today. I think it's really important that you reach out to those people in your network just to make sure that, they're okay. I always want to leave somebody with something positive to think about, maybe just a little, bit of sunshine that I can bring to somebody's day, just something positive, because there's so much negative out there in the world right now.
Thank you for listening to Intention. This podcast can be found where podcasts reside. Please subscribe, and we'll be talking again soon.